very much. It's really a pleasure to be with you today. And I'd like to thank the BNCC for the invitation to talk about the Brazilian economy and then all business opportunities between Norway and Brazil. So it's really a pleasure. So to start this discussion, I will share a presentation with you to guide here our discussion. And to initially talk about the Brazilian prospects, I would like to share with you a very quick overview about Brazil, about the Brazilian economy. So I will start with I brought here positive and negative factors. So I will start with the positive factors. And the first point that I would like to highlight is that Brazil proved to be a strong democracy. Despite all the challenges and threats that we have seen in the last years, we proved that the institutional powers in Brazil are strong. And recently we have the presidential election, which was very polarized, a very difficult one with a lot of threats and so on. But we could have a normal election, and then we have respected the result. We have seen the power transition into a new president, the current one, Lula. So the strength of the institutional powers, in our view, were proved. So this is the most important thing in our view, talking about Brazil. Also, I would like to highlight the main reforms that Brazil implemented in the last years, especially since mid-2016. We implemented a lot of reforms related to the macroeconomic environment, like fiscal rule, I would say a ceiling on public expenditure, also a social security reform, a labor reform, and also we approved a lot of reforms related to regulatory frameworks, and especially related to infrastructure, sanitation, airports, railroads, roads, in order to facilitate the entry of the private sector in the infrastructure business. So it was really important, these new regulatory frameworks and also new concession models built on that to bring the private sector. Also, we did a lot of reforms to develop or to help develop or spur the capital markets in Brazil, and also to increase competition in the banking system. And we also saw in the last years an advancement of technology in different sectors in Brazil, but mainly related to financial and healthcare systems in the last years. So this, I would say, a very quick overview about the positive factors in Brazil in the last periods. But when we talk about the negative factors, I would say that constraints of labor productivity are very important in Brazil. And of course, it limits productivity as a whole and potential GDP. And these constraints of labor productivity are mainly related to income inequality. And this has been worsening since the pandemic, given all the regressive effects of the pandemic on income inequality. So it's a limit to our potential GDP. Also, we have left the demographic bonus period. So now we cannot count on demography, or I would say working age population growth to grow in a stronger pace. Now we depend much more on reforms and investments to increase productivity and then potential GDP. Also, a negative factors, despite the strength of democracy and the institutional powers, the reality is that we have a political polarization in Brazil. It's a very polarized situation that we have in the last years, but it continues at the moment, and with institutional powers. So, of course, this point has negative effects on the economy because it hinders coordination, cooperation among the different actors. So it limits, of course, the agenda, the reforms, and the positive effects on the Brazilian economy. And finally, I would like to focus on fiscal imbalances. We had the fiscal issue, of course, before the pandemic, especially since the big recession that we had in 2015 and 16, but the situation was worsened by the pandemic because we spent a lot. We have increased the public expenditure in relation to GDP, and now we have to deal with a much difficult situation talking about the fiscal issue. So just this quick overview for you to know the positive and negative aspects of Brazil and of the Brazilian economy. And now turning to our new moment with a new government. So as I said, we had elections last year in October, and the opposition won the election, and the candidate was the former Brazilian President Lula. Lula comes from a left-wing party called Workers' Party. And for us here to understand the political scenario and the consequences for the Brazilian economy, I brought here this exercise to show you that Lula, just with left-wing parties, is not going to be sufficient to rule or to pass important reforms in the Congress. So what I'm trying to say, that the new government, Lula's government, needs to agree with other parties, but also not just center parties, but also with right-wing parties, in order to have sufficient votes in the Congress to pass important reforms. So this exercise here is to show you that, for example, in the lower house, for us here in Brazil to have a constitutional amendment, we need 308 votes in the lower house. To have approved like normal projects with just absolute majority, we need 257 votes. So when we consider just the left-wing parties that were with Lula during the campaign, we are talking about 140 congressmen in the lower house. So it's very, very far away from what they need to pass important reforms. When we do these exercises with some center parties, like MDB, for example, we have around 224 congressmen. Just when we consider some right-wing parties in this coalition, we have a more, I would say, interesting number in the lower house, something around 283 congressmen there to support the reforms. So it surpasses the absolute majority, but is still not there when we consider the constitutional amendment. So the main point here, and this is what is behind our baseline scenario for the Brazilian economy. The new government should agree with other parties, but not just center parties, but right-wing parties, in order to pass important reforms in the Congress. And this is going to be very important in our view, because the risk is not a pure left-wing agenda, but the risk here is instability in the coalition. But if the new government is able to manage this coalition very well, the agenda is going to be much more centered. So we leave the extremes and we go much more to the center, talking about the main topics of the economic agenda. This is what is behind what's behind of our baseline scenario for the Brazilian economy. These forces, the Congress forces acting to bring the agenda much more to the center. So when we talk about the economic agenda, I brought here the main figures in the economic team. So we have the finance minister, Fernando Haddad. Then we have the planning minister, Simone Tebet. And the third one is the vice president, Geraldo Alckmin, who is also the industry and commerce minister. And the point is that these names are a reflection of the broader coalition need. So they come from different parties, and also they have different views on the economic agenda. And this is, I would say, it's difficult to understand with different names and different views on the economic agenda. It's difficult to have a very clear picture of the main path of the economic agenda. So this is true. There are some uncertainties about the conduction of the economic policy, given this heterogeneity of economic orientation. But when we talk about the economic agenda, especially from the macroeconomic point of view, I would like to highlight the fiscal aspect. So as I said, Brazil saw an important increase in public expenditure in relation to GDP, so in public indebtedness in relation to GDP. So now we have to deal with this. And the new government is pointing to higher spending. So we are going to a scenario with higher spending. And here there are the uncertainties. Okay, we are going to spend more, also given the regressive impacts of the pandemic, but how we finance these higher spendings. And there are huge discussions about that, because in our view, we need to increase the taxes in Brazil to finance at least a part of this higher spending. But the new economic team is also discussing a new fiscal framework. So they want to change the ceiling rule into a new one. And we do not know yet the new fiscal framework. So the main risk that I would like to highlight here is the fiscal one. We have here the risk of being quite irresponsible in the fiscal field. But as I said, in our baseline scenario, given the forces coming from the Congress, but also the fire alarms coming especially from the financial markets, we expect the fiscal issue also going to the center. We expect a more moderate approach also in the fiscal arena. But just to say that is an important aspect of our economic scenario for the Brazilian economy. Well, talking about other agendas, other priority agenda of the new government, I point here 5 topics which are understood as a really priority by the new government. The first one is this new fiscal framework. They are going to present now in March this framework, but we've got some here, news on that they are really worried about to have some caps on expenditure and some aspects related to public debt in relation to GDP, some triggers related to public debt in relation to GDP. But let's see they are going to present now in March. The second point is the tax reform. As you may know or not know, Brazil has a really chaotic tax system. We have different taxes, from municipal taxes to state taxes and federal taxes, and there is a huge overlap among them. So it's a very chaotic system, and we know that it limits productivity and potential GDP because the transaction costs are really, really high in Brazil related to other emerging economies, which have a much more better tax systems. So this is a really priority to implement a VAT system in Brazil. So we have a good opportunity right now because we have good projects already in the Congress, and they are going to put really some, strength on that. So there is important probability of going forward with the tax reform. The third aspect, very important one, is the environmental agenda. As you may know, this environmental agenda was left behind by the former government. Not just left behind, but I would say that Brazil lost a lot of controls to avoid deforestation. So this loosening of controls, we saw the huge consequences on deforestation, and now the focus and the target is zero deforestation until 2030. And they have listed a lot of measures to achieve this target, but the main one is the recovery of focused public policies related to deforestation. So we are seeing here a very good room and space to going forward with this much more focused public policies on the environmental agenda. And this topic is very important to explain the fourth one, which is the foreign policy. The new government wants to rescue the relations with other key global players. In the last years, Brazil was really, really isolated from the international community, given, of course, some aspects related to the environmental agenda, but also related to democracy, the principal rules of democracy. So Brazil was really isolated, and now the new government wants to rescue these important relations. And for that, it's really important to carry on with the environmental agenda. And finally, I would like to highlight the point that the other topic that's a priority for the new government, which is the resumption of the EU-Mercosur trade agreement. This agreement was signed in 2019. Since then, is under legal review, but we know that there are a lot of resistances against the agreement, environmental issues, but also from the automotive industry in Argentina to carry on with the agreement. But we see now a very good opportunity considering the global scenario, the huge change that we are seeing in the global scenario, but also the new approach of the Brazilian government, especially related to the environmental agenda. So we see now a window of opportunity to carry on with this agreement. So these are the main 5 topics here that are priority in the new government's agenda. So given that, I would like to, based on our baseline scenario hypothesis, I would like to present our projections for the Brazilian economy. So starting with the Brazilian GDP growth. So here, as you can see in the chart, probably Brazil grew 3.1% last year, which was quite strong, remembering that during the worst moment of the pandemic, the Brazilian GDP fell 3.3%. Then we had a very strong recovery with Brazilian economy growing 5% in 2021. And what was behind of the very strong GDP growth, of course, was the much more controlled pandemic situation with vaccination especially, but also a very important support coming from the monetary and fiscal policies. Then we have this strong performance of the Brazilian economy in 2021 and also in 2022. But for this year, as you can see, we expect a quite strong slowdown of the Brazilian economy, growing around 0.9%. And what is behind? The global scenario, the slowdown of the global economy, but also the timing of the monetary policy in Brazil to deal with higher inflation. So we expect to see the consequences of the tighter monetary policy, especially this year. And finally, the uncertainties about the political scenario, the new government, the fiscal agenda. So, and also uncertainties related to the monetary policy and the central bank are waiting on economic activity as well this year. Once we are right about the baseline hypothesis that I just presented to you, we expect the Brazilian economy to recover gradually from 2024 on. So as you can see here on the chart, the Brazilian economy goes back to something around 2% of GDP growth in our baseline scenario. So, and as I said, as the whole world, Brazil is also facing higher inflation higher than the target. The target for this year is 3.25. So we are projecting 5.8% of consumer inflation, the same level that we had last year. But last year, we had a lot of taxes breaks, but especially on foods, which were really important to bring the inflation down. But this year is in our projection, some tax recomposition on foods. So that's why the inflation remains at the same level of last year. But from 2024 on, as you can see, inflation goes down in a very gradual way to something around 3.4%. We are still considering the target at 3%, but there are some discussions in Brazil about the inflation target. If Brazil should or not to increase the inflation target to something around 4.5%. The discussion, and of course, there are some pressures on the Brazilian central bank to reduce the interest rates. So I will show you here in the next slide. This is the base interest rate in Brazil. Nowadays, the interest rate is running at 13.75%, which is really, really high. Just remembering that during the pandemic, the Brazilian central bank has brought the interest rate to 2%. So then it is poor, the economic activity, but since 2021, the Brazilian central bank has been hiking the interest rate. So nowadays is at this level, which is really, really high, in order to bring the inflation down. But given our past in terms of inflation, the Brazilian central bank is very, very tough in this field. Given the inflationary memory that we have in Brazil and all the automatic adjustments in pricing, considering the past inflation. So Brazil normally is very, very tough on that. And it explains, besides other structural factors, the high interest rates. But if we are right about the baseline hypothesis, and about the much more pragmatic economic policy, especially on the fiscal field, we see a room for the Brazilian Central Bank to reduce the interest rates beginning at the end of this year and bringing down the interest rates to something about 9% in nominal terms. So, but anyway, there are some discussions about inflation target and the level of interest rates in Brazil, which is also behind the higher uncertainties that I just presented to you. So, talking about the exchange rate in Brazil, nowadays our exchange rate is running at 5.15 reais per dollar. And as you can see here in the chart, we expect a quite depreciated currency, not just at the end of this year, but also in the next years, because we have higher interest rates in the rest, in the main economies, but especially in the US, but in the main economies. Also, we expect some accommodation in commodity prices, and the Brazilian real is a commodity currency. So when commodity prices go a little bit down, it pressures the exchange rate. And of course, it's behind the fall that we expect in our base interest rates. So when we put all together the interest rates abroad, the interest rates here in Brazil, commodity prices, and also risk perception, we expect the exchange rate to be quite depreciated in nominal terms, but also in real terms. Well, and given this scenario, especially talking about the baseline scenario, I also brought here some industry investment insights, or in other words, sectors that we are really optimistic, sectors that in our view should grow in a stronger pace in the next years. So I would like to focus on energy, and in this aspect, Brazil has really good points or sectors to bet, especially solar and wind power projects. These solar and wind power projects are located in the northeast part of the country, where we have very favorable conditions. So these are sectors that should grow much above GDP growth. Other aspect talking about energy is biofuels. Brazil has a very good productivity in biofuels. Of course, they are a little bit more expensive compared to fossil fuels, but the productivity in Brazil is very interesting in the main biofuels, but also especially in ethanol, and also green hydrogen. Brazil has, in our view, a huge potential on that, giving, of course, this alternative sources of energy, solar, wind power, biofuels. Of course, the huge potential comes from that, but we are still lacking government incentive and regulatory framework. But especially under the new government, we see a good room to carry on with these topics to explore the green hydrogen here in Brazil. Also, infrastructure, it's a very interesting sector in our view, given the past reforms in the regulatory framework to attract the private sector. So sanitation, where Brazil, I would say, has very not beautiful numbers related to sanitation in some parts of the country. So we really bet on sanitation to spur these infrastructure investments, and of course with consequences to Brazilian GDP. And we have a new regulatory framework that attracts the private sector. Railroads as well, we have a new regulatory framework bringing the private sector in. and also the framework that we have and other business models to roads, airports, and ports to give these concessions to the private sector. The other topic is the extractive industry. Brazil is very competitive, talking about in iron ore. We have very good projects in the north part of the country where productivity is very high and the iron ore quality is very high as well. So we are very optimistic about iron ore, but also about oil and gas production in the next years, given the past investments and of course some advantage here talking about comparisons. And finally, technology. We have seen huge investment volumes in innovation, and the main areas here in Brazil are the financial area, the healthcare area, but also energy, giving the positive conditions that we have in some alternative energy sources. So we are seeing the volumes increasing in the last years. Of course, 2021 was really, really strong. Now we are seeing some adjustments in this industry, but the trend is very positive in our view, especially in these fields: financial system, healthcare, and energy. So, well, just some takeaway points here from this very quick presentation. So, as I said about the new government, the need of broad coalition and fire alarms should limit negative agendas by the new government. So, bring these agendas much more to the center, with a much more pragmatic view, in our view. In the macroeconomic arena, the main risk is on the fiscal side. So we have to be very responsible talking about expenditure, the new fiscal framework. We have to control expenditure in order to have a sustainable fiscal situation, talking about the public debt in relation to GDP. And also considering the new government's agenda and the current global scenario, there are opportunities here, especially talk about businesses between Norway and Brazil. So, as I said, the new global logic, considering the conflict in Europe, the problems related to energy, of course, the effects of the pandemic, the new logic of nearshoring and friendshoring is there. So there are opportunities here in our view, considering the aspects that I have highlighted here during the presentation. Attraction of investments related to the environmental agenda and energy, giving the priority of the new government on these two topics, and also the advancement of the EU-Mercosur agreement. There are resistances, as I said, but we have a space now to diminish this resistance to go on with the trade agreement. So I think that I will be very happy to answer your questions and to discuss a little bit more on that. Thank you very much for your attention.